My family called me a failure at dinner. 2 years later, I sold my startup for $80 million and vanished. And then, it started with a glass of Merlot and that kind of thick, unspoken tension only families can cultivate over decades of quiet hierarchy and passive-aggressive tradition. We were gathered in a candlelit dining room that hadn't changed since the early 90s, all heavy oak and silence dressed up as civility. My sister, Marla, was halfway through her second pour, swirling the glass like she was performing for a camera that didn't exist, every gesture rehearsed, every glance curated to remind us who the successful one at the table really was. She wore a tailored navy blazer that probably cost more than my last 2 months of rent, her earrings catching the light as she laughed at something Frank, our father, had just muttered about offshore markets and economic instability like she knew exactly what he meant. I was across from them, dressed in the same faded flannel I'd worn that morning while debugging a nasty API loop, trying to decide whether the stuffing was salvageable or whether I could get away with pretending to be full. Nobody had asked me much of anything since I got there, and I was fine with that. I wasn't there to perform. I never had been. Marla had always been the one with the spotlight trained firmly on her face. President of every club that mattered in high school, full scholarship to Stanford, an MBA before she turned 30, and now a rising star in a consulting firm that flew her to cities I only heard about in podcasts. She shook hands with politicians and tech CEOs while I sat behind a second-hand desk in my basement apartment, writing the kind of code that most people wouldn't even recognize as important unless it broke. Frank still introduced her with that puffed-up pride that always made me feel like I was just someone they had to mention out of obligation. Marla here is leading this new international integration strategy, he'd say, eyes gleaming like her success reflected directly back onto him. Meanwhile, I was just Julian, the one who dabbled in tech or worked remotely. Vague descriptors meant to politely mask the fact that no one really understood what I did, and even if they did, they didn't think it mattered. Halfway through the second course, Marla turned to me, her wine glass resting lightly in her fingers like it belonged to her more than the hand that held it. You know, it still amazes me how you've managed to go this long without doing anything with your life, she said, loud enough that even Delilah, our mother, looked up from her roasted carrots. The words hit the table like a dropped glass, sharp and embarrassing, but no one said a thing, not at first. My fork hovered midair, chicken halfway to my mouth, and I didn't even have to look up to feel the satisfaction radiating off her like heat. Frank chuckled, not a full laugh, but that smug, low hum he saved for moments when someone else said exactly what he wanted to say, but couldn't be bothered to put into words himself. He didn't look at me. He never really did. Marla leaned back in her chair, crossed one leg over the other like she'd just sealed a deal instead of insulted her brother in front of their parents. Honestly, Julian, you're like a walking cautionary tale, she continued. A man who peaked in high school and just coasted into nowhere. And there it was, finally, the word that had lingered in their glances and their too polite silences for years, now spoken out loud and left to hang in the space between our plates like a sour smell. Failure. I set my fork down without a sound, wiped my mouth slowly, folded the napkin like I was performing my own quiet ritual. I looked around at these people. People I'd spent most of my life hoping might one day see me, not as a disappointment, not as a footnote, but as someone worth noticing. Then I smiled. Not sarcastically, not bitterly, just quiet and calm, the kind of smile that makes people nervous because they can't tell what's behind it. All right then, I said, my voice steady. Don't ask me for help when everything starts falling apart. No one replied. I didn't storm out, didn't shout, just took another sip of water, stood, and told Delilah thanks for dinner. On the drive home, headlights flickered past my windows in a steady rhythm that matched the pulse in my temple. I rolled down the window halfway, letting the November air slap against my face as I pulled into the lot behind my apartment building, the kind where your neighbors either ignore you completely or try to sell you weed in the laundry room. Inside, the ceiling light flickered once and stayed dim, like it had also given up trying to impress anyone. I tossed my jacket over a chair, plugged in my laptop, and got back to work. Because what Marla didn't know when she raised her glass and twisted the knife with that sharp tongue, what Frank didn't know when he laughed like it was all just an amusing anecdote at my expense, was that I had been building something for nearly 2 years. Every night after my contract gig ended, I sat alone in that cramped studio with cracked drywall and coded through the silence, creating a data bridge tool that could unify systems most companies thought were impossible to align. Not flashy, not beautiful, but absolutely game-changing if I got it right. I hadn't told anyone because I didn't want their voices in my head. Not when it broke. Not when it stalled. Not when the bank account got too low for comfort and all I had left in the fridge were instant noodles and expired almond milk. They'd assumed silence meant failure. But silence, for me, had become the place where everything important happened. Where I got good. Where I got focused. I worked until nearly 4 a.m. that night, tweaking a sequence that had been throwing errors in the new build, my fingers cramping around the keyboard and my eyes burning, but I didn't stop until it was clean. Because something was coming. And when it arrived, it wasn't going to knock. It was going to break down the damn door. The morning it all changed started like the ones that came before it. Head foggy from too little sleep, half a protein bar on the desk, a string of alerts from an error monitoring tool I hadn't shut off in months. The laptop screen glowed in that familiar low blue hum, and I was still in last night's clothes, trying to convince myself that one more bug fix wouldn't kill me. But then the screen shifted, just slightly. A new notification from a tracking dashboard I'd set up weeks ago to monitor enterprise interest in the beta version of the platform. I stared for a full minute, not quite processing the numbers that had just spiked across the analytics board. At first, I thought it was some glitch, maybe an automated script that scraped the site by accident. But then a second spike, and a third, and by the time I opened the admin panel, the inbox was overflowing. The subject lines didn't make sense at first. Partnership proposal, Series A inquiry, keynote speaker invitation, media interest, call request, and then my phone began to vibrate with the persistence of a fire alarm. I blinked at the screen, heart thudding a little too loudly in my chest, as the call Idaho flashed with a name I hadn't expected to see for months. My lawyer. "We're closing," he said, voice measured but excited. "Full acquisition, 82 million. IP rights intact. They want you on board for a transition phase, but we can negotiate that." I remember standing slowly, barefoot on that cold concrete floor, and feeling like the walls of my tiny apartment were too small to hold what was happening. I didn't yell, didn't pump my fists or call anyone. I just stood there, staring at nothing, letting the moment settle into my skin. Because I'd imagined it. Not like this, maybe, but some version of it. During those late nights when my fingers cramped from typing and the silence screamed louder than any insult Marla had ever thrown across a dining table, I imagined this exact feeling. The quiet click of everything falling into place. The company had been operating under a shell name, something vague enough to avoid suspicion, something I used so that no one could tie it back to the guy whose own family had labeled him a lost cause. I'd built the entire platform under the radar, outsourcing nothing, documenting everything, and making sure that if it ever went public, it would be airtight from the inside out. By the end of that week, my email was drowning in invitations, proposals, interview requests, and event panels asking if I could speak to the journey. I accepted too, ignored the rest. The money hit my account 3 days after the papers were signed. 8 digits, clean and immediate, staring at me from the banking app like a dare. I didn't touch it. Not right away. I sat there and stared at those numbers, thinking about every version of myself that had wondered whether it would ever be worth it. Every moment I doubted the silence, doubted the grind, doubted whether any of it mattered. And all I could think, sitting there in that room that still smelled faintly of burnt coffee and cheap takeout, was, of course. The texts started rolling in a few hours after the news broke. A cousin I hadn't spoken to since high school. "Dude, just saw your name on Techport. Holy shit." A former coworker who once said I lacked vision. "Would love to catch up. Maybe collaborate sometime." Then Marla. Her message came in around midnight. Just 2 lines. "Wild seeing you in Techline. Would love to catch up soon, smiling face with smiling eyes." No mention of the dinner. No mention of the word she threw at me like a stone. Just that emoji, like everything was fine. The next morning, Frank chimed in. Proud of you. Need some quick advice on investment options if you've got time. I stared at that message longer than I'd care to admit. The man hadn't asked about my work in 5 years. Now suddenly he wanted insight? From the failure with no future? I didn't respond. Instead, I bought a one-way ticket to Lisbon, packed 2 duffel bags, and left the keys to my apartment on the counter next to the cracked mug I'd used every day for 2 years. The place I rented was perched on the southern cliffs, white stone, glass walls, and an infinity pool that spilled into the sky like a secret you never had to explain. The first night, I didn't unpack. I just stood barefoot on the terrace and watched the sun drag itself into the Atlantic like it was tired of shining. The quiet didn't feel heavy there. It felt earned. Back in the States, I could still feel the tremors rippling through the family. I hadn't heard from Delilah directly, but her silence was louder than the rest. She'd always kept her head down when things got tense, eyes on her plate, hands clasped like she was hoping the moment would pass if she just didn't breathe too loudly. But even she broke eventually. Her message came on a Tuesday. I know we weren't fair to you. I hope you're okay. I'm sorry. I didn't reply to that either. Not because I hated her, but because answering would have cracked something open I wasn't ready to deal with. A few days later, the tone shifted. Marla again. Hey, I know you're probably busy, but I was wondering if we could talk. Something came up at work, kind of complicated. Then Frank. Julian, things have gotten a little rough. Marla's company might be heading toward restructuring. She made some risky moves, and there's talk of a leadership change. It's a mess. Maybe you could help her out. I read the message once, then again, then just set the phone down and poured myself another cup of black coffee, letting the steam fog up the window as I watched the waves throw themselves against the rocks below. None of them had planned for this. They'd built their lives around appearances, titles, wine-stained grins, power plays disguised as dinner toasts. They thought planning was everything. That success came from checking all the boxes and keeping up the image. They planned for retirement, planned for promotions, planned for being right. But they hadn't planned for me. They hadn't planned for the quiet one to win. And when they laughed that night, when Frank chuckled and Marla twisted the knife, I could almost guarantee they hadn't imagined a version of the future where they'd be the ones asking me to save them. Still, I said nothing. I didn't block their numbers. I didn't craft a clever response or post a viral tweet about proving everyone wrong. I just let their messages pile up, one after another, tiny monuments to everything they thought I'd never be. Because what they wanted now wasn't conversation. It was access. And I had finally learned the difference. It had been 3 weeks since I last looked at their messages, and by then the notifications no longer triggered anything. Not curiosity, not bitterness, not even the flicker of old instincts telling me I should at least see what they wanted. I kept the phone on silent and left it flipped over on the edge of the kitchen island, more paperweight than Portal, while I read, cooked, swam, and occasionally worked on a private side project that didn't have to earn me anything except the satisfaction of knowing it functioned exactly how I intended. I'd traded chaos for salt air, the echo of my name for the sound of wind across water, and the quiet was so deep some mornings I didn't even notice the absence of noise until a bird screamed from the roof, like it had something urgent to say. Then one morning, that piece cracked, not shattered, but chipped just enough to make a line across the surface. There was a knock on the villa door. Not the buzzer, not the intercom, not even a heads-up text, just the dull rhythm of knuckles against wood like someone was too embarrassed to use the bell. It was early, sun barely stretching across the coast, my coffee only half made, and I wasn't expecting anyone, not even the woman who brought produce once a week. When I opened the door, Marla was standing there, arms crossed like armor, her hair pulled back in a way that tried to look professional but betrayed the rush she must have been in when she left wherever she'd come from. Her makeup was lighter than I remembered, or maybe just worn down by the flight, and her shoes, still expensive, always expensive, were scuffed near the toe, a detail I wouldn't have noticed years ago but now couldn't unsee. I was in Barcelona, she said quickly, voice thinner than usual. I rented a car. Thought maybe I'd just drive. I didn't say anything at first because I wasn't sure what I wanted her to see on my face. Curiosity, indifference, something more final. But what I felt was something closer to wariness than rage. She shifted, like standing still made her nervous. I had your address from when Mom forwarded it. I should have asked, I know. Still, I said nothing, because everything she wanted from this moment depended on what I did next, and I didn't know her the ease of moving forward on her terms. I wanted to see you, she said finally, looking past me at the sliver of the living room behind my shoulder. Not for anything, just to say it in person. I stepped outside and pulled the door shut behind me, locking us into the breeze and whatever truth she had the nerve to carry this far. We sat on the low stone bench that looked out over the cliffs, the wind tangling the ends of her blazer while she tried to compose the version of herself that could handle vulnerability without completely breaking. I let the silence sit between us, not as punishment, but as a filter, to see whether she could sit in the space without trying to fill it with noise. Finally, she spoke, eyes still locked on the sea. I was wrong, she said. Not just that night, about you. The words came out flat. No crescendo, no dramatic pause, just the quiet defeat of someone who'd run out of narratives to protect herself. I nodded once, not to forgive her, but to acknowledge that at least she'd finally said it. I thought I came here for closure, she added. But now I think maybe I just wanted to see what it looked like. Your life, without us in it. I could have said a lot in that moment. Could have reminded her of how she'd weaponized silence when I needed kindness. How she'd cornered me with condescension and laughed when Frank laughed. How she never once considered that I might be building something while she measured success in title promotions and vacation photos from conference hotels. But instead, I just said, it's quiet. She glanced at me, maybe surprised by the honesty. Too quiet? She asked, like she still believed discomfort was something worth escaping instead of examining. No, I said, watching the horizon stretch like a secret. It's just enough. She looked down at her hands, twisting a ring around her finger, one I didn't recognize. I miss you, she said, not softly, but directly. I nodded again. I missed the version of you I thought might come eventually, I said. But she never showed up. Her mouth opened like she wanted to say something. Maybe to fight back, maybe to beg, but nothing came out. The wind kept blowing. The waves kept breaking. And she just sat there, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. After a long pause, I stood. I hope you find peace, Marla. I really do. She looked up like she was still searching for some crack in the wall I'd built, but I didn't offer her one. Not because I was cruel, but because I finally understood that boundaries weren't cruel at all. They were survival. I walked back to the house, footsteps slow but certain, and I didn't look back until half an hour later through the wide glass window near the hallway. Her rental car was gone. No note. No dramatic scene. Just absence. And that was the moment I realized something I hadn't dared to believe until then. She hadn't come to fix anything. She'd come because she was scared that maybe I was fine without her. And I was. After she left, I stood on the terrace long after her rental car disappeared behind the bend in the coastal road, the air still carrying the scent of her perfume like a question that didn't get answered. I expected something, some kind of internal unraveling, some delayed reaction. But there was no crashing wave of anger, no victorious relief, no lingering sting of old resentment clawing its way back up. There was only quiet, undisturbed and complete, as if her presence had been a dream that never really touched the place I had built for myself. The following morning felt different, not lighter, not heavier, just more still. I moved through the house as I always did, making coffee slowly, barefoot on cool tile, steam rising against sunlight pouring through open windows. I didn't check my phone. I didn't think about who might be messaging me, who might be hoping that her visit had opened something they could walk through. That part of me, the part that wondered what they were thinking, had finally gone quiet. But something had shifted. Not in a way that made me want to reconnect, but in the realization that I no longer needed to even carry the weight of disconnection. I wasn't resisting them anymore. I was simply done. I walked out to the bench where she and I had sat the day before, the wind brushing over the stone and the distant sound of a fishing boat cutting through early surf. I unlocked my phone for the first time in days, But instead of reading any of the messages, I started deleting them. I didn't do it out of spite. I didn't read back through old texts, looking for insults to justify my silence. I just pressed and held, selected the thread, and erased it. Marla, Frank, a handful of cousins who only ever remembered my number when it showed up next to a headline. A manager from 5 years ago who once called me not quite leadership material. I didn't even feel satisfaction as they disappeared. Just space. Then I opened my email, deleted 3 requests for interviews, ignored 2 invitations to speak at panels in cities I had no desire to visit. I declined an offer to consult on a new venture fund run by someone who used to laugh at how quiet I was in meetings. None of them knew the silence they mocked was the very thing that made space for the work they now wanted a piece of. I walked away from the screen and out into the yard, where the wild rosemary bushes scratched at my shins and the wind carried gull cries across the cliffs like unanswered prayers. I stood there for a long time, watching the sea chew at the rocks below, and I let the world go on without needing to explain my absence to it. A week later, I moved again. Nothing drastic, just further along the coast, to a house with fewer walls and more trees, where the locals didn't care what I'd done and the markets didn't reach. The place had no gate, no smart system, no imported finishes. Just worn wood, sun-washed tiles, and a kitchen that opened to the sky. I didn't announce the move. I didn't tell anyone except the woman who delivered fruit twice a week. I stopped sharing anything that could be traced, not because I was hiding, but because the person they were looking for no longer lived inside me. I had changed shape and shed every trace of the version of myself who once would have explained that to them. And then something beautiful started to happen. People appeared, not from the past, not from memory, but from the present, the real now. A man from Utrecht who built frames from driftwood and lived in the van parked under the olive trees. A software engineer from Buenos Aires who used to work in fintech, but now spent her days teaching kids how to repair solar panels. A woman named Rue, who played the violin barefoot in the plaza at night, never asked me what I did, and always brought me lemons from her garden like it was a holy offering. None of them cared about what I'd walked away from. None of them needed me to explain anything. They met me where I was and stayed there. I started mentoring again, this time anonymously, reaching out to 2 teenagers in a local school who reminded me so much of myself, it almost ached. They didn't have resources or connections or polished resumes, but they had drive and curiosity and a stubborn, quiet brilliance that no one else in their lives seemed to notice. We met every Thursday at a rooftop cafe with chipped cups and sticky tables, where we talked not about startups or exit plans, but about clean logic, ethical code, and how to build something real even if no one clapped for it. I didn't teach them how to win. I taught them how to build. And in doing that, I started to rebuild something in myself. Not success, not ambition, but belonging. A kind of quiet, rooted belonging that didn't rely on approval or applause, that didn't disappear when the money was spent or the praise faded. Back in the country I'd left, I heard through secondhand messages that Frank had taken a hit when the market dipped, something about a pension fund that hadn't been diversified properly. Marla was quietly removed from her position after an internal audit turned up numbers that didn't quite line up. Delilah moved in with her sister and stopped answering questions at book club. No one reached out. Not anymore. And I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't feel anything, really. Just distance. They had built their world on certainty and image, convinced that status and structure would hold forever. They planned for everything except being left behind. I watched the sunset that night with a glass of dry red wine in hand, the ocean burning with color, the air warm against my skin. Inside, someone laughed, a deep, honest sound that came from a soul not twisted by ego or expectation. And I realized I hadn't just walked away from the people who underestimated me. I had walked into a life so free, so clean, that their memory could no longer cling to the walls. It happened on a Tuesday, the kind of day that sneaks by without ceremony, too plain to remember unless something splits it open. I'd just come back from the village bakery with still warm bread under my arm, coffee already cooling on the edge of the table, when my phone, now mostly used for grocery lists and music, lit up with a name I hadn't seen in months. It was her again. Marla. No emoji this time. Just a short line of preview text that read, "Please read this." I should have deleted it the way I had the others, but something about the weight of it, about the fact that she was still trying to speak into a silence I never once interrupted, made me tap it open just this once. The message was longer than usual, and it didn't sound like the Marla I remembered. There was no polish in the phrasing, no sharp corners meant to cut me in the ribs while pretending to hug. It read like someone tired of holding up a version of herself that had finally collapsed under its own arrogance. "I don't know if you'll read this," she wrote. "And honestly, I wouldn't blame you if you didn't. But I wanted to say that I was wrong. That dinner, we were awful to you, and I've replayed that moment more times than I want to admit. I was cruel, not because I thought you were nothing, but because I was scared that you might actually be more than I could ever be, and I didn't know how to deal with that. You didn't deserve what I said. I see that now. I'm sorry. Truly." I stared at the screen for a long time, not out of indecision, but because for the first time since all of this began, she sounded like someone I might have wanted to know if we hadn't shared blood and history in silence. But I didn't reply, not because I was angry, not because I wanted her to suffer, but because silence had become my language, and I had no intention of translating it back into something that required performance. Some apologies aren't meant to be accepted. They're meant to be released. A week later, I got the last message I would ever receive from Frank. It came through voicemail, and I didn't listen to it directly. I read the transcription out of idle curiosity, while peeling an orange near the window, the breeze lifting the scent of citrus through the house. He said he was staying with a friend temporarily, that the pension wasn't stretching far, and that if there was any way I could help, just for a little while, it would mean a lot. He used the word proud again, tried to slip it in like it had always been there, like it hadn't been wrapped in laughter at my expense just a few years earlier. I didn't reply to that either, because by then, I'd learned something that no inheritance could teach you, that the most dangerous currency in any family isn't money, or love, or even truth. It's permission, and I wasn't handing that out anymore. So I deleted that voicemail, turned off my phone for the weekend, and walked down to the cove where no signal could reach me. I swam until my arms burned, then lay on my back in the sun, listening to the waves slosh against the rocks like they had nothing else to do. That night, I had people over, not guests, not visitors, just the small circle of odd souls I'd found since arriving here. We drank wine too early, played music too loud, and talked about everything except who we used to be. And that was the moment I realized what I'd built wasn't a retreat or an escape. It was a life. A complete one. One without footnotes or explanations or apologies squeezed between text bubbles. I didn't post about it. Didn't share photos. Didn't write a status update about how the black sheep had made it after all. Because I wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone anymore. I hadn't just left them behind. I had outgrown the version of myself that needed to be remembered by them at all. Months passed like chapters you don't bookmark, the kind you don't need to reread because they were never confusing to begin with. My days filled themselves without effort, mentoring quietly, building small tools that helped people no one noticed, walking barefoot along trails carved by wind instead of cities. And then one morning, I opened the news out of habit and saw a headline tucked between a political scandal and a new tech IPO. It was about Marla's former firm. Fraud. A collapsed portfolio. Lawsuits. I didn't even blink. Didn't feel sad or smug. Just turned the screen off and poured more coffee. There's a myth that you need closure to move on, that people must apologize in just the right way before you're allowed to leave the fire they set. But that's a story made by people who are afraid to move on before the curtain call. Sometimes you don't get the final scene. Sometimes you're already on the plane, already building a life somewhere else, while the stage you burned behind you smolders in silence. And sometimes, if you're lucky, you forget what the applause was supposed to sound like in the first place. So no, I didn't go back. Didn't check on them. Didn't keep a window open in case they came to their senses. I built something stronger than reconciliation. I built a life that didn't require their approval to exist. And every morning, as the sun slid over the hills and into my kitchen window, I greeted the silence not like an enemy, but like an old friend who always knew I'd make it here eventually.